And the topic today is called emotional regulation. And that is about training the muscle that shapes your mind. One of my favorite topics and uh, very, very related to a great portion of my work. But we're going to be doing it live. And I welcome anybody to check in, say hi, um, comment, compliment, or start a fight or something like that. My whole body of work is about, shifting from reacting to responding and, reclaiming control as the dominant force and shot caller of your life experience. And, case in point, shit happens, and there's no, I don't believe there's an existence other than that time that we're 6 feet under where shit stops happening. So we have to learn how to become shit navigators. The universe. Great morning to you, Sam. The universe has mysteriously placed everything. I don't know if you notice this, but tell me if you do. The universe has mysteriously placed everything that we desire, or everything of worth that we desire, inconveniently on the other side of a big pile of shit. So that's what I mean. It's your choice is to either become a shit navigator or avoid shit and thus never get anything that you really truly desire. Great morning to you, Lori. I love the way she writes great with an eight. I love it. So please check in and say hello. Our podcast, is ranked 59th in under the heading of education all over. And, so this is going to be a podcast episode. And if anybody gives me some great, conversation and content on the topic, we might leave that in the podcast and give you a little bit of a shout out. I'm very, very much a proponent of playing a role in helping you grow your Substack and everything like that. So great morning to you, Stacy Adair Hickson. That's an interesting name, Stacy. I like that. Feel free to comment, and all that stuff. And I always say at the end, if you learn something today, give it away. That's how it's going to stay. So once again, welcome. Great morning, everybody. This is your boy, Dr. JC Dornick, aka the Dragon. And I'm going to be sharing with you a Substack that I wrote that I'll be posting. And I'm basically going to read it to you today and take the liberty of accenting it with a little bit of on the fly live stuff. Given Grace is in the house. Great morning, Given Grace. So I know that all of you woke up this morning, and whether you recognize it or not, we're blessed with 24 hours. And, you get to decide what you're going to do with that. And you're here with me right now. So I take that very seriously. I'm full of gratitude that you're going to take some time. We're going to be together for about 20 minutes where I'm going to read this to you. And I hope that, and it's my intention and not hidden agenda, but my agenda is to provide you with a new perspective. In a world where we're not really thinking for ourselves, the world is kind of thinking for us, whether you can recognize that or not. So if I provide you with a fresh new perspective and I get you to go, which stands for haven't made up my mind yet. I hear it. I'm going to think about it. That's your prefrontal cortex. That's the small part of the perception and sense making machine and sequence that's happening that you control when you're in your conscious mind. So that's why I do what I do is if I give you an interesting thing to ponder and think about, which requires that you allow it, you have to be open and curious. You have to have your right protect switch on your SD card open. If it's closed, you're just going to run your regularly scheduled program, your default mode program today. And if that's working for you, great. But if you're not satisfied with where you're at and you want to go to new higher places, then open that switch and just entertain what we're going to talk about. So this is emotional regulation, training the muscle that shapes your mind. So let's get into it. So when people talk about self-improvement, which is a huge industry, they usually picture things like weights and gyms and, a morning routine. I'm a huge advocate of the morning routine. Or maybe chasing discipline or like it's some sort of badge of honor or things like that. But I contend, so this is just my offering here, I contend that the most important muscle that you'll ever train or have the opportunity to train, which you have right now with me and develop, isn't one that is visible in the mirror. So you see where I'm going with this. It's not your arms or your legs, your biceps or your calves. It's an invisible muscle that we call emotional regulation. And that's the one that shapes and protects how you think, how you feel, and whether or not you react or respond to the world that's around you. So listen up, listen up, and I hope that you love this. Feel free to share this on your in your notes or anything like this live, and pay it forward to somebody else because I think this is a special one. So I didn't always know this, by the way. I'm going to share some. I'm going to get a little bit vulnerable and transparent with you. For most of my life, I actually thought that emotions were something that you either had or didn't, and they kind of acted like the weather, and in the sense that you had no choice but to accept and endure it. So if I ever had anxiety, and I've experienced a lot of anxiety, and I would contest that I'm probably experiencing anxiety right now. I'm just responding differently to it. But like the weather in the sense that anxiety would therefore kind of roll in like thunder. And then what I had to do, and a lot of you have spent your life doing this, is I would have to learn how to wait it out. Sometimes I would notice that anger would boil up, back to that weather, idea. Anger would boil up and I'd let it spill over sometimes, not intentionally. And then it would start impacting others. But then joy, let's not forget the other side. Joy would often, arrive like sunshine, and I would cling to it when joy I love joy. I love fulfillment and joy and happiness, and I would cling to it as if it was like some sort of ultimate euphoric hit of dopamine. I think dopamine's getting a bad rep right now. I think there's good dopamine hits like joy. I love joy, experiencing joy. So it was like some sort of euphoric hit of dopamine, and then I would kind of like go through this process of hoping that it would never fade and I would chase it. So I thought my emotional life was like kind of like a spectator sport, if you understand that analogy. Um, and it was something that was happening to me, but not recognize how it was happening for me or even through me, my experience. I just love that idea of just recognizing that maybe things are not happening to you, maybe they're happening for you or through you. But then I learned what neuroscience has been saying for decades. This is what's interesting when you have a breakthrough. It's like you don't learn anything new, you just become aware of something that was and has always been, like the universal laws and stuff. So, neuroscience has been telling us for decades that emotions aren't just storms that pass over us, they're actually signals and patterns and even opportunities once recognized. So this is a big part. This is a shift right here is that we either become conscious and recognize things, or we just hand the keys of trust over to our default mode program and just see where it takes us. And you know where it takes us. It's taking you here, which is not necessarily a bad thing. So there's signals and patterns and opportunities once they're recognized. But emotions are forms of energy in motion, and they're fueled by our brain's chemistry, but they're also filtered through its old programs. This is a big part of your perception of reality today is you're perceiving things, but it's being filtered through old programs if you're not conscious of this. And it's also magnified by the stories that you're telling yourself. That's a big thing to take a look at. What story am I telling myself? Because if you acknowledge that, you can also say, what story do I want to stop telling myself? Is it time today that you're here with me to drop your story or rewrite it? So, and just like muscles, the way that we engage with them, it can be trained. All this stuff can be trained and shaped and formed and strengthened and refined. So, this is both a good thing and a bad thing, a double edged sword. And that depends on the degree that we're open and curious in our conscious participation. So, I'm going to throw a stop right there and just acknowledge that all of this fun stuff that we talk about is a waste of time. I always say learning is nothing more than a distraction in the absence of action. So it's a waste of time to learn something or hear something new if you're not open and curious, because your default mode and your beliefs and your principles and your core values and all those things, your analytical mind, your ego is just going to say, interesting, but I disagree. Right. So you won't even let it happen. So, like most, I had to learn this stuff the hard way. Right. Isn't that interesting how the things that we want the most, the greatest things, seem to kind of play hard to get? The universe or God or whatever it is that you look at as the higher power governing body makes the things that we want the most really hard to get. And isn't it interesting that the things that we don't want are really easy to get? So I had to learn this the hard way, and that was through one of my greatest fears, and that was public speaking, ironically, as I speak publicly to you. So for years, and I'm just going to share a little bit of transparency here. Great morning, Eric's Corner. I hope you guys all consider looking at who's here in this live today and just kind of go, I wonder why out of the 8 billion people out there, we're here watching this. You guys are having the same experience at the same time. I think you should follow each other, subscribe to each other, and try to figure out why. So for years, the thought of standing in front of a room made me feel like I was going to suffocate. There was a time where I loved the idea and I started this career of public speaking. But as it got bigger and bigger and bigger, and some interesting things were happening in the background of my life, it became something that I was afraid of. So my heart would pound, my palms would sweat, thinking about the Eminem story, right? Or song, knees weak, palms are sweaty. So my heart would pound, my palms would start to sweat, and my throat would even close, and I would almost like hyperventilate, and my brain would kind of like feel like it shattered into like thousands of fragments of panic. It was just a mess. And I used to think, I remember I used to think when I felt like that about a public speaking, even when I found out I was going to do an event, and it would build up over like 3 months until that moment I was walking out on stage. I just remember thinking, like, this must be proof the way I'm feeling that I'm not cut out for this. I'm just an anxious person, and anxious people don't do public speaking. So I just remember thinking that way, like maybe I should find another gig, but I really wanted to be a speaker. And I also had learned at that time, maybe this is that shit that is sitting in between what I desire. So I just started to do some research and I found some really, really cool stuff. So, but I remember in that moment, I'd look around at other what I perceived confident speakers. That's another thing, is I thought other people were confident. I didn't know what other people were going through. Consciousness is a subjective experience. We don't know what it's like to be one another. We only know what it's like to be us at any given time. But I would look around and perceive conscious or confident speakers and envy how they seemed like unfuckwithable. Like they would just be like, yeah, I'm going to go out there and crush it. But what's interesting about that is that's the way I used to act in front of others too while I was dying inside. So take note of that. I pretended I was unfuckwithable as well. So I assumed that they were wired differently, imposter syndrome, right? Comparative reality. They were born with some sort of missing gene that kept them calm in the face of this adversity, or at least some sort of gene that I was missing, I thought. So do you guys recognize that in your life? Do you kind of like all of a sudden perceive that something that you really want to do well, like writing, other people do it like without any trouble at all? So remember that story. So what happened with me is, because I decided to do it anyway and I did some research, is I stumbled upon something that really changed my life. And I hope that when you come across any of my work, that you find yourself stumbling upon something that has the power to change your life. I mean, that's, I guess, how I'm going to find self-worth in the world. And I would assume that's why you're right. So I stumbled upon something that changed my life forever. And that was a study that showed like two brain maps. And on those brain maps and in the study, it showed how anxiety and excitement show up almost identically on brain maps. The activity centers of somebody that's excited versus somebody that's having a full on panic attack. So heart racing, breath quickening, adrenaline flooding the system. What's interesting about those symptoms that I was perceiving as a weakness is they're the same physiological responses that someone would be having if they were just elated or excited. So this study was a massive breakthrough that made me go, what else might be true? So the only difference between the two brains in this study was the story that they were telling themselves about what was transpiring. That was the breakthrough. So remember, we're talking about emotional regulation and training our brains to do this stuff. So that insight cracked something open in me and basically created this space. This is the beginnings of the work that I started to do. And it created this space where I had like this conscious, logical, rational ability to start rewiring my brain's perception and its response system. So I built this thing called the interface response system. So I started asking questions like, well, what if I'm not broken? What if all that energy coursing through my veins was just actually fuel that was waiting to be directed? Think about that. The next time you feel anxious or revved up, and your initial knee jerk perception is that it's a negative thing. What if you looked at it as energy and fuel that was just waiting for direction? It had no direction, right? And I was giving it a negative direction. And it was like, okay, what if I was actually the writer, the director, and the choreography of this show that was taking place, this show called life? So the next time that I had to speak, I decided to put it to the test. And when you first start doing something, it doesn't work right away. That's why I came up with this concept called praction, where practice and action meet. The first time you practice being in action in a new behavior, you're not good at it. You get good at it along the way. There's a big misperception I think that we have to be good at something to do it, that it's a precursor. It's not. We get good at things along the way. So I put it to the test, and instead of saying I'm anxious right before a talk, I told myself, I'm excited. This is an awesome opportunity. This is energy. This is power. And what I did was I was able to reframe the signal, at least to a small point. I was able to reframe the signal, and I caught myself in the middle of a panic spiral. I remember this. I was going out in front of thousands of people. I became conscious that I was in the middle of a panic spiral, and I ran it through what I call my new sorting filter. Now, those of you that are in my Make Sense Academy, which is a good group coaching environment, which is awesome, we teach this thing called the sorting filter, and we help people build it. But I ran it through my sorting filter, and it worked. So the pounding heart didn't vanish, the symptoms didn't vanish, but they changed from a negative thing to some sort of a euphoric and gratitude producing, confidence producing thing. So I got excited about going out on stage, which I had to be careful of because you can have some unhealthy ego driven confidence, cockiness or whatever. So there's so many moving parts to this, but this was a breakthrough for me. So my shaking hands steadied, and what I did was I leaned into my new story that I was excited versus scared. Um, and it's just this sense of gratitude. And I learned through that, by the way, for those of you that do want to do some sort of speaking and it makes you nervous, I learned how to neutralize a lot of that negative energy by starting my talks off with giving gratitude. Because gratitude places you where? In the present moment. It's the only place that the things that you have exist. So that was my first actual experience with what I now realize is called emotional regulation. I regulated my emotions. I think the true cause of disease in the world, upstream from it all these things that we're trying to treat is, emotional mismanagement. So here I am managing my emotions and practicing emotional regulation. And what I did was I stopped suppressing and I stopped denying things and I just started reframing, which we have the choice to do. We can decide to reframe anything, right? And it just hinges on how much you're attached to what society thinks about what you do, right? I don't really care what society thinks. I just care what the people that matter most to me think. And so I very often wear shirts that say breaking news. I don't care. I do care, but not about shit that doesn't matter. Hey, just want to say hi to Hina. Good to see you, Hina. Hina is an amazing writer. Love her stuff. So I would highly recommend that you go get some henna in your life. and be Philippe. I think that's the way to say Philippe. I'm French, so I can say things like that. And there's another great writer, Nova Wildwood. These are great people. I'm honored that you're here with me today, talking about emotional regulation. So here's the thing. Without giving myself permission to pause, you have to give yourself permission. You have to allow yourself to be open and curious about what else might be true. Without giving myself permission to pause and consider what else might be true, none of that stuff that I just shared with you would have been able to happen. And I think a lot of people are caught up in this, not giving themselves permission to reevaluate, look at things from a different perspective. When my book comes out in February 2026, it's going to be launched at an event called Creative Con in Chicago. If anybody's in the Chicago area, it's a great event for writers. But when my book comes out, you'll learn quite a bit about that. Um, it's this idea of giving yourself permission to pause and consider things, consider alternative vantage points, look through different lenses. For those of you that don't know, the glasses that I wear don't have lenses in them. And it's not really a gimmick. It's this conscious decision to remind myself that I call the shots. If I had left the lenses in the glasses, something external would be having a say in how I see things. So I took the lenses out. Isn't that interesting? So whenever you meet me in person, you're going to be like, is that guy not wearing have glasses with lenses? Jason Charles, great morning to you. So, this was something that helped me create what I call the interface response system. Ironically, the initials are the IRS, but the good kind. So the IRS is simply, a powerful four-step process that, consists of perceive, pause, process, and then proceed. Perceive, pause, process, and proceed. If you go to my Make Sense with Dr. JC podcast, which is just unbelievable how fast it's growing. You can listen to the first 10 episodes and get the gist of the interface response system. But what's key to note here is that the emotional regulation, the idea of it, it lives in the second step called the pause. So you have to have a reason to pause, and you also have to allow yourself to pause. But emotional regulation lives in the pause. So the pause is kind of like the hinge on a door. If you can imagine the hinge on which a door, kind of moves back and forth, or our conscious perception, which would be the door swings. So that's what the pause is. The pause is kind of like the foundation for the swinging of our perception. Make sense? So most people live in the gap between perceive and react. So that's an oscillating pattern is you perceive something, you allow your conditioned mind and your program to react and you don't catch yourself, which would be the pause, and you just react. So that's how you move from reacting to responding. So I teach people how to say which is HMMM, which stands for haven't made up my mind. Why do we have to make up our minds so fast? Well, I'll tell you why, because we've been conditioned to, because the person that's asking you questions is wanting a response very quickly. I'll share something about that in a second. So, when you begin training and strengthening your emotional regulation muscle, and that's just an analogy, but you begin wiring yourself differently and also widening the gap, giving yourself more time. Jason Charles Geiger is in the house. So you see, that's what you do is you widen the gap and you give yourself more time. You buy yourself more time and create space to notice the thought and feeling without being ruled by them. Isn't that interesting? I always like to give the analogy like your heart beats. Do you evaluate every beat of your heart and allow one of those beats to have a say in your day? No. Well, your brain, like your heart, your brain thinks 40,000 to 70,000 times a day. So isn't it interesting that we have this way of allowing some of those beats of the brain to dictate who we are? So that's what happened to me with public speaking. And you're seeing it happen right now. The reason why I go live, it's partly for you, but it's also a healing process for me. I've been doing for years. And I'm committed to doing it for the rest of my life. And for me to say that I don't get nervous before I even do something like this would be a lie. Of course I do. But I don't perceive it as a negative thing anymore. I perceive it as an exciting opportunity to potentially reach somebody. So the trigger was the same, with public speaking, just as it was for this. A room full of eyes, a body of, my body was on fire with pumping adrenaline and all that stuff was the same. But the pause allowed me to process it and say things like, is this fear or is this fuel? And from that pause, by reclaiming control, and this is Viktor Frankl's work. That's where I got the idea that the game is won in between the stimulus and your response, right? That's what the pause does is it puts you in that space and widens the gap. So from that pause, I was able to process, I'm sorry, from that pause, I was able to proceed with intention instead of panic. Make sense? So the more I studied all of this stuff, I got very excited about it. My best friend is Jim Quick, and he taught me how to speed read 25, 30 years ago. So I read about a book a week. So those are the kind of books that I like to read is human behavior and the response system. So the more I studied this stuff, the more I realized that emotional regulation is kind of like a hidden superpower that we all have. We all have it. And it's something that participates in every aspect of our life. So think about it. I'll give you a couple examples. So maybe we have a couple that is arguing late at night, right? Could be me with my wife that I call the chicken. So without regulation, the argument can escalate into words that you will later regret. Have you ever had that happen? Of course you have. With it, there's a pause. So this is with the regulation. There's a pause, a breath, and maybe even a very you know, healthy space of silence that saves the relationship from unnecessary wounds. So there's some of the value. How about a leader of a big company, a leader that's under the vast pressures of running that company? Without emotional regulation, the people of the company, right, that are looking to that leader for leadership, they may lash out, or maybe the leader will lash out at them. So with it, they can channel the stress into explicit and decisive action and become a forward moving process that moves the ball down the field towards the touchdown. One last example, maybe you're a parent and you're dealing with a screaming child or an unruly child, whatever that means to you. Without regulation, they explode. And I think we know that. We always joke in a dark way of what we wanted to do when our kids were screaming as babies. So with emotional regulation, they can kneel down and connect on the level of the child and maybe model at the same time, model what it's like to be calm in the face of adversity, right? And then emotionally regulate the child. The thing we hate about a crazy kid is that we made them crazy or we see something we don't like about ourselves. It's that mirror moment. So the outcomes are night and day, but the trigger never goes away. The trigger stays the same. The only difference is the reflexive nature of this muscle of regulation. So, and just like muscles, regulation gets stronger with training. This is what I love about personal growth and self-development is you can train these muscles. Never gets easy, but it gets easier and you get stronger and you get better at it and your reaction time lessens. So the practices are not complicated, but they require consistency. So exercise, for example, isn't just for the body. When you push your limits physically, you're teaching your nervous system also how to metabolize stress. I love that analogy. So you're expanding your window of tolerance, which can be a good thing, and ability to not take things personally. That's another aspect of the pause. So nutrition matters in the same way as when blood sugar spikes and, you know, it can produce emotional volatility. So eat well and you'll stabilize not just your body, but your mood. This was a huge breakthrough for me. And still to this day, I recognize it that I would experience and I will experience feelings and sensations and perceptions of depression after eating unhealthy food. Does anybody else agree with that? I'd love to hear your take on that. If you eat crap, what does it do to your mood? It might be fun during it, a little bit of a dopamine hit. But does anybody agree with that? So Nova Wildwood says yes. So isn't it funny how we still find ourselves like eating crap? It's like you must want to be in a bad mood, you know. But if you're conscious and you pause, and a lot of people don't know, but for 20 years I've been a health transformation coach, and I've helped hundreds of thousands of people in effect with weight loss and nutrition and things like that, but mostly behavior modification, instilling healthy habits. So this is a big thing. We teach them how to pause and think about it first and say, wait a second, I want to feel good. Why would I do this? This doesn't in any way, shape, or form apply to my goal. So I've identified also breath work and meditation. Any meditators out there or breath work practitioners? Um, did it this morning. It was a huge, huge, win for me this morning. It always is. But I've identified that breath work and meditation are like two really powerful levers for this. So a long exhale tells your brain, hey, everything's fine, you're safe. It can also shift your nervous system out of that fight or flight mode and into what I call rest and digest. Isn't that fun? The opposite of fight or flight, to look at rest and digest. Just listen to your breath and just digest the moment that's happening in the present moment. So whether things are actually taking place or not, it gives you time. So meditation and mindfulness, that what they do, I think, is that they place the focus on the observer inside of you. One of the most powerful things we can do is flip a switch from being a participant in something and just becoming an observer, like you are of your heartbeat, right? Like you're watching a movie. You can do that with your thoughts and feelings. So, meditation, I feel, allows me to connect with the observer on the inside of me. And that's the part that can watch the emotion rise. See, that's different. When an emotion rises and you identify as the emotion, you're not an observer of it, you're a participant of it. It becomes your identity. But there's this version of you that I feel comes out in meditation that can evaluate and watch the emotion rise without having to align with it. So I also like to journal. I'm reading you a journal entry right now. That's what I'm doing. It started off as a journal entry. The first things that I wrote this morning when I started this journal entry is I just heard the concept of emotional regulation and I just wrote down, with a question mark. Emotional regulation. What's that about? And all of this came from that in my morning routine. If anybody wants more information on any of this stuff, my morning routine on our group, Make Sense Academy, which is just a really, really nice psychological safe haven for us to do this work rather than just learn it. Just reach out. You're live with me now, but this will live in the notes and on the Make Sense Substack. So let's not forget sleep. I call it nature's nurse, which is probably one of the most overlooked regulator. And I'm not going to lie to you, it's something that I'm challenged with because I like to be awake. I like to wake up early. But it's a regulator of systems, and it also determines whether your brain wakes up with, a fighting chance or not. You know, Sometimes we wake up already depleted and we have to fight that whole day. So the irony is that in all of this stuff is that people pursue these practices for reasons that sound more practical or external, like exercises for fitness. That's why I exercise. Eating clean is for weight management or chemical balance, or meditation is something that I do for focus. But I just want to entertain. This is the point out. This is the maybe also that beneath all of those things, there's a potentially deeper payoff, and that's emotional steadiness. So, the work of emotional regulation, that's the practice, could produce what we call emotional steadiness, which I just love. These habits aren't just shaping your body, right, or shaping your mind, they're also training your emotional muscle rep after rep. That's the way I look at it, and that's day after day. So that's why I see emotional regulation might be the most underrated form of self-care. I love the topic of self-care, and one of the most underrated forms of it is emotional management, emotional regulation, leading to emotional steadiness or stableness. So take note also that this is not glamorous work. You'll notice that nobody is going to applaud you when the argument never happens. Think about that. If somebody wants to have an argument with you and you have this high degree of emotional intelligence and emotional regulation, and that doesn't facilitate into an argument, they're not gonna be psyched. But that's the whole idea. There's these people out there we call flow burglars that, like, are kind of born to take away your thunder. They don't want you to be emotionally regulated, so it's not glamorous, right? They want things to erupt. They want a meltdown. They want the anxiety, to transform into a fire, and all that stuff. They don't want you to get excited about that and say, what can I learn from this? That's not what's going on. But these invisible wins that you'll have are just something that accumulate. There's a compound effect to this stuff. And the flow burglars will leave you alone because they'll find somebody else that does have a reaction rather than a response. So they take shape. These things take shape in your life in ways that nothing else can, if you really want to practice this stuff. And we do this in the Make Sense Academy. Come check it out. We offer a free trial. Was that just a pitch? Maybe. But a healthy pitch because it's like not expensive. So people will take note of your energy, calmness, and demeanor, and that will attract the right people. Your vibe will attract the right tribe. So in closing, we're in a world that is kind of designed to hijack our attention and our nervous system. You know, if you look at social media and all of this stuff, it's looking to hijack and acquire your attention and your nervous system as well. You know, Emotional regulation, therefore, becomes a big disruptor of that. Sam says, Yo, soul inspiration with Elise. I would love to know what some of these names mean. By the way, I'm somebody that loves to support like real, authentic, hardworking writers. Um, so reach out to me. The best way to reach out to somebody on Substack is through direct message. Send a direct message and be like, "Yo, Dragon, like I would like to have a conversation with you." And we're starting this new show called The Writer's Way. Once a week, I do these interviews. I'm going to be traveling this week. So if you would like to be a guest on that show, I don't care how famous or infamous you are, let me know. And we have a form you could fill out to become a guest on The Writer's Way. There's a couple people in here that I've already invited to do that. So in a world designed to hijack our attention and nervous system, emotional regulation becomes a big disruptor. So the algorithm and big advertisers that are involved in it want you to stay impulsive, right? Politicians, think about what a politician wants from you. A politician wants you to be outraged about what they're talking about, right? They want you to buy in, and social media wants you to become addicted. That's what the whole game is. That's the intention. Sam says, "Yo, Dragon, I would like to do a live with you." I just I'm just assuming that's what Sam says. So Sam, direct message me and say that because the dragon gets a lot of messages from the other world. Direct messages, I don't get a lot. So say that and be like, "Yo, I want to do a live," and then I'll be like, "Okay, let's find out a little bit more about that." So emotional regulation is about reclaiming enough space in your mind to decide who you want to be in this moment right now. Who do I want to be in this moment right now and why? Regardless of the trigger, regardless of the storm. I'm going to tell you that at about 2:30 in the morning last night, I was going downstairs, something was left on the stairs and I slipped and fell down the first flight of our stairs and crashed into a wall. Hurt my arm, broke two toes, and that's what happened last night. So you want to talk about like shit happening and having to regulate that and reframe that. Like imagine I'm bleeding and I broke two toes and I'm saying, what is the lesson here? you know, Not easy. Easier said than done, but better done than just said, right? Oh my God. Yeah. I'm 54 and I fell down a flight of stairs last night. And my whole family, well, of course, thought I was like dead and everything like that. I'm very, very grateful because I know it could have been worse, um, that I can still take a fall, you know. But anyway, okay, you sent the DM. Great. So, just in closing, looking back on my journey in public speaking, I can actually see now that what I thought was a weakness was actually a training ground. I want to invite you to look at this day ahead of you and everything that you're going to do and experience as a training ground. It's a totally different perspective to approach this day with. I'm going to train today. I'm going to do some reps today. That's a great way to detach from outcomes. Is to just look at it as training. I'm going to go to the gym later, which is going to be tough with the broken toes, but I'm going to go anyway and just navigate and be agile. But I'm gonna go train, but I'm not gonna expect to walk out of there, like, swole and jacked up, you know? It's a training ground. So the anxiety that I was having back in those days that I still experience on a different level, but I've reframed it, it wasn't my enemy. It was actually a weak muscle that was waiting to be built and shaped. Isn't that cool? I was able to turn the very thing that once crippled me into, I guess I could say, fuel for connection, influence, and purpose, and things like that. So, as I'm doing right now, I'm doing this right now with you, is I'm taking the maybe I shouldn't do this because my toes broke and all of that stuff, and I'm tired because I didn't sleep, and I'm a little anxious, and I'm worried about what people will think of me and all that stuff. And I said, I'm just going to do it. And I feel much better now. So that's the gift that's waiting for all of us. Not a life without emotion, right? That's a fool that thinks that's going to happen. A life without adversity, but a life where the muscle of emotional regulation shapes not just our mind, but our destiny, our future, right? I don't spend a lot of time in the future. I'd like to stay in the present moment. I'm always working to do that. But I know that what I do right now and the work that I do in the training has a very big say in what happens in the future. And maybe that's the most accurate definition of strength and health. It's not the power to control life. I don't think that it's about learning how to control life, but having the presence to meet it and choose your response. Who am I right now? How do I want to show up and how do I want to respond to this? Including, by the way, one of my favorite choices, and that would be to not have to respond at all. That's an option as well. Make sense? Love and appreciate you. Thank you so much for being here live. This is going to record and it's going to go on there. And if you enjoyed this today and you learned something today, give it away, share it to your notes, leave us a comment, share it with a friend that you think would enjoy this. It's a free thing. If you want to find out about our Make Sense Academy or become one of our paid subscribers, which is just such an honor to get $8 a month from somebody. And what we do for them is we give them a daily live every day. We give them a live message that might be like a little synopsis. So we help people start their day. If you want to be on the writer's way, let us know, and we'll let you fill out the form. And we love and appreciate you all, and hope to see you next time. Have a wonderful day. Thank you.